Most of the men that I work with deal with knee pain, lower back issues, hip pinches, some sensations around the SI joint, or even irritations at the level of the shoulder. But it didn't typically start at those regions. From assessing dozens of them, I've come to the realization, or I've seen like 80% of the time, it stemmed from their hips. And not because they are tight, or muscles are short, which is the diagnosis that everyone claims or goes for, but simply because they are undercapacitated. Meaning they have a harder time managing the stressors and the loads that are coming in on a day-to-day basis, especially in the regions that have been neglected throughout the years. So in this video, I'm going to show you why undercapacitated hips are so important to understand and could be one of the most serious aggravators of restrictions and pains, not only at a local level but also globally across the structure, and how you can reverse the effects by building athletic and anti-fragile hips by zooming in on a couple of movement patterns that have had the highest bang for your buck for both the people that I work with and myself, in order to make your hips much more powerful and decrease certain symptoms. So the frame that I want you to hold for the next couple of minutes is that I want you to understand that hips have a very, very important responsibility. Whereas the spine initiates movement, at least according to a theory called the spinal engine theory, which is based on our spinal curvature that, in combination with gravity and locomotion, so movement through space, has a way of bending, which has a cascading effect on how the hips and the shoulders are positioned in order to make movement happen. That is also the theory that I like to dabble in with, because I found it very useful and a good premise to start with. Well, from this point of view, spine initiates your movement, but hips accelerate it. And that's because we're always in relation in this gravitational field, right? This is something we cannot escape. And through millions and millions of years, definitely not only by humans, but I think all of the organisms that, or most of the animals that have lived on this planet, we've had to found ways in order to handle the forces that are coming in. And that also goes for our structure. And the bridge between the trunk and the lower extremities is the hips. So the way we like to manage forces is that we have this in movement initiation, but the hips determine a lot in how forces are going into the ground and coming back from the ground. So when you walk or run or throw, squat, sprint, that is always what is happening. We're always in a state of how can we utilize force that is coming in, put it into the ground so that it pushes back up, and utilize it there as well, which is called the ground reaction force. So the responsibility that the hips have is because of their degrees of freedom, basically of the ranges of motion they can move in and out to, which means that just like the shoulders and the spine as well, they have three. Meaning that we can rotate, we can adduct and abduct, we can also go into forwards and backwards movements. That is all present inside of the hip. Now, this means that if you lack certain ranges of motion through potential having neglected stimulating your hips, what could happen is that, let's say, for example, if you zoom in on the hip and you lack some external range of motion according to your anatomy, over time, this could mean that the position of the hips determines also the position of the knees. So if you lack a little bit of range of motion, maybe on a day-to-day level, it doesn't mean much, but accumulatively, it means that potentially the knees need to compensate in order to still make movement apparent. But if the knees tend to cave in or tend to compensate, caving in is just a strategy that it could use. The foot tends to arch as well, so it goes more into pronation, all in order to stay in alignment with gravity and movement continuous. So that is something that could happen. Now, this for overtime or restrictions around the hips could also mean that your glutes don't fire as well as they can, and therefore could potentially have more of of a load on your SI joint, which is something I see also with clients. They have some more pressure on the SI joint where the sacrum matches the ilium crest, but it's also because their glutes have not been in a situation in which they have been stretched to their fullest potential, build strength in that full stretch position, full range, for a longer period of time. That could also mean that the lower back needs to cover more demands or loads that are coming in. So this representation is not a one-to-one causation, let me be clear. And it's also not a statement that if you compensate that everything is wrong and you need to do whatever you need to do. That's not the situation, because posture is something that is very adaptable, which is a very intelligent strategy. And as long as you don't have pains or restrictions, then you're all good. The only problem arises is when you have certain restrictions, either at a local level or global level, that keep you from expressing the movement that you want to do, or limiting the movements that you potentially want to go for. And that is the real problem here. It's that if you feel restrictions, or if you have restrictions around your hips, that it decreases the capacity or your capacity to deal with stressors and demands that are coming in, which keeps you in a state of pain or restrictions, or don't want to move. That is the real problem. So what we want to do is we want to look at that situation, or we want to look at the hips and make sure that their capacity across the ranges of motion you can access, and hopefully can access for more decades to come, becomes more, so that your stress management or the management of loads that are coming in becomes better, because the stressors are becoming less due to an increasing capacity. So that is the first and foremost objective of improving our hips, because they have such an important responsibility in how we move through space. And just to give you an even deeper example of that responsibility, I want to give you the idea, or show you how we are actually locomoting through space, and how the hip has an effect on how we do that. Because the hip, they don't work in isolation. And as you just saw here, if the hip is restricted and we have to manage forces and push it into the ground, the knee could potentially have a compensatory strategy as a result. But it could also mean that there's a compensatory strategy at the lower back or upper the chain towards the rib cage and the shoulder, which could all stem from potentially hips that aren't fully expressing themselves. So that means that hips don't work in isolation, but in integration, meaning that everything in your structure moves. If something doesn't move, it could have a ripple effect on other elements, and that could have an effect on other elements. Again, not a one-to-one causation towards a specific symptom or pain that you might be experiencing, but more of an underlying root cause effect that could have a root, stems from a root that is potentially located in the hips. Now, we already discussed that the hips have 3 degrees of freedom, meaning we can move into 3 ranges of motion. We have the sagittal, forwards and backwards movement. So forwards often flexing and backwards is often extending. Then we've got frontal, which is a adduction or an abduction, and transverse is the rotational movements that we can do. The importance of the hips is, I think, very much demonstrated in the Gait cycle. So the Gait cycle is a model, a representation of how you can see or imagine what the hips do as a more visual or visceral effect. So the hip or the Gait cycle is a simple, or not a simple, but it's a representation of how we manage those forces that are coming in. And if you see, or if you look closely and strip everything down, what the Gait cycle actually shows us is that we're always, when we move, we are falling. That is what gravity does, it pushes us down, and then we catch ourselves, we sort of absorb force, and then we push ourselves forward. So the phases of a Gait cycle is a landing, loading, and launching phase. And I want to show you how the hips and the pelvic region have such an important play such an important role in this force management. of gravity that is pushing down on us. So what you can see here as we're striking the heel, so at the 0 point, it starts with the pelvis, so how the pelvis is orientated. And we're then moving from heel striking, we're moving into an internal rotation of the extremity or the pelvis all the way down towards the midfoot. So we're into an internal orientation, meaning that the pelvis is internally rotated, the femur, the tip, the subtalar joint, and the midfoot. So everything is more geared towards an internal direction. And that is because internal orientations have us absorb force. Then we load the force, or we basically load the forces that are coming in when we are transitioning towards more of a mid-stance position. And then once we have sort of maximally loaded, maximally pressed force into the ground and have it come back at us, we then are going more into an external orientation in which the femur, the pelvic femur, tibia, they all move more into an external orientation in order for us to push forward, to launch ourselves. So from midfoot to all the way of a later stance before swinging is when we are moving into an external orientation and then push forward. Now in these orientations, which are predominantly internally and externally geared, we also of course incorporate flexion and extension and abduction and adduction. But this just gives us a representation that if, for example, you feel some restrictions, which I often see with men in, it's either that they have more internal range of motion on the one side versus the other side, and they have more of the other expression on the other side as well. So, but what this does over time, because if you complete just one walking cycle, that doesn't mean much. But if you walk, 3 to 5 to 7, 8,000 steps a day, and those restrictions are compounding, it could have an effect on how your lower extremity is positioned, but also how the upper part, the trunk, is being positioned as a compensatory strategy if certain restrictions are present. So this model gives you just a very good representation that the pelvis, the orientation of the pelvis, and then the femur, where the sort of the ball and hip socket of the hip, where that is present, that determines everything that is going down the chain. And then when the force is coming back up, it also determines what is coming up the chain and how that is positioned, which makes this idea of how important and how much responsibility the hips have very apparent and very important for us to know in order to make sure that we want to prioritize a lot of our focus on building hips that are anti-fragile, that can express their movements maximally, and of course all the tissues surrounding the hips, the pelvic region, and lower down the chain and up the chain. So that is just something that is very important to understand. Now, once we know, or now that we have got a good understanding of, okay, we know that the hips are very have a big responsibility, and we also know how that responsibility plays out, for example, in a model like the Gait cycle, how can we actually restore those hips? And I think this is where a lot of training programs make things extremely complicated, in the sense that we have a tendency to try to isolate everything with dozens of exercises, with multiple rep ranges, with a lot of volume, a lot of sessions. And from my personal experience, if you truly strip it away, there are just a couple of components that we want to hone in on in order for us, in this case, to specifically improve our hips. And that is, in my opinion, always stems to two elements. And that is, you want to build strength at a full range of motion, sometimes specifically more towards end ranges, so sometimes more specifically throughout a full range. And what you want to do is you want to try to stimulate as much areas as you can in this force output moment, so that the brain and the nervous system has more sort of can utilize more of these synaptic pathways in order to create the best movement option for the movement task at hand. So it's basically the more areas of the body we can stimulate through this synaptic pathway all the way from the brain towards motor units, the more we can do that, the more we're leveraging the brain and the nervous system's capacity to choose from all of these different sort of force roads that we have and choose the best one. So then we go towards the 3 patterns that I want you or would like to give you a little bit of a demo of, which in how to execute it and why they are so important. But first, I want to start with a principle just to make clear why we want to be very precise with our signaling. So what we're doing when we are stimulating growth or when we are trying to improve end range of motion or full range of motion, we're trying to induce a catabolic event or more of a catabolic event inside of our tissues, meaning that we're breaking down a little bit of our organism in order for it to change, come back stronger, more adapted towards the load or the demand that is coming in. And this is something you can see here. So this would represent a cell. Now, often, a majority of time, the programs that I've faced myself and also saw other men, at least that I work with, perform, is that there's a tendency to provide a very gradual load input and have maybe just a very small element or small part of the session that is actually stimulating growth at a tissue level. But your cells, they don't really care about how load is coming in or if you build it up gradually, etc., etc. They have a certain threshold, and when that threshold is being met, that is when certain events, cascading events inside of the cell, are going to be present in order for the tissue to come back stronger and better. So rather than spending a lot of our time sending a signal that doesn't hook at the outer parts of a cell, that then don't create this effect, then that haven't met that threshold, what we want to do, or the idea I want you to convey here, is that if you can be extremely potent in your stimuli, so in the way you create tension on a mechanical level, if you can be very precise and potent there, the quicker you're basically sending a signal where the outer layers or the structure on the elements on the outer layer of a cell feel the need to hook towards that tensed area and then have this cascading effect inside of the cell. So I personally like to go for very precise and potent signaling so that we are very precise with that catabolic event and spend much more time on the anabolic side of things, where recovery takes place, the tissues heal, and we don't pressurize the nervous system as much, which also has to manage daily responsibilities, deadlines you're meeting on a day, relationships that you have to manage. Like, all of these different things fall in the same bucket, and the more precise you can be with your catabolic event on a tissue level, the more time you also have for other parts, and just let the tissues heal in a more, in my opinion, proficient way. So the first exercise we're going to go over is the 1 leg squat elevated. So this is a pattern that works hip flexion to hip extension and covers some of the largest muscles surrounding this hip or pelvic region. Of course, we've got the quads, the hamstrings, but specifically the quads and the glutes are working maximally here, but you also have some components at the hamstrings and the calves as well. Now, the core idea with all of the patterns, in order to induce a very precise signal, is that there is just one training variable or training metric that we want to utilize or modify, so that we can always increase or decrease the difficulty depending on the pattern, and we can not only increase or decrease it over an entire set, but more specifically during a repetition. And that is very important because it will give us the option to be very precise with our time, but also see a certain pattern as a set on itself, where we have multiple inches or parts that we can stimulate. So for the 1 leg squat elevated is loading the flexed or working leg as much as we can. In this case, I'm carrying 2 backpacks with around 60 kilos. And this has me, or in this way, I have the arms free in order to help me execute on this movement pattern in the most proficient way as I can. So what you can see me do here is I start in my deepest position, meaning I am trying to be fully flexed. And that flexion occurs at the level of the hip, it also occurs at the level of the knee, and it occurs at the level of the ankle. So it's a triple flex position. And the reason why is I'm trying to be in that max flex position so that I'm not only targeting as much of that skeletal muscle, but also its surrounding connective tissue or interwoven connective tissue, but also connective tissue at the end ranges. Now, from this position, the only objective I have is to get myself upwards in this flex position towards the standing position while loading this front leg as much as I can. So as you can see, I'm moving extremely slowly, but I'm trying to push as hard as I can. And therefore I'm alleviating the rear leg, and I'm only supporting or grabbing myself at the supports here upwards when needed. So I'm trying to push with only my leg, keeping the torso a little bit upright, driving the knee forward, so maximally engaging the quad. And I'm just going extremely slowly, not because I'm controlling it, but it's just because it's so hard. And only supporting it with the hands. Now, this means I'm working all of my muscle fibers all at once. I'm trying to engage every one of them, and I'm trying to do that for as long as I can. So I go inside of a pattern, and once I feel stuck, I take a little breather and then I go again. And as you can see, that requires so much of my energy in just one single moment, because I'm recruiting all of my muscle fibers, that I need to take breaks. But I keep doing this all the way until I reach the top. Then when I reach the top, I reset and I do it again. I'm trying to load the eccentric phase as much as I can by still trying to release as much of the support of the hands, keeping my knees driving forward and slowly going to the ground. And the idea that I have here is that instead of, again, voluntarily slowly going to the grounds, it's more of a necessity that I prevent myself from falling. So I'm pushing into the ground as a way to prevent myself from falling, only assisting here with the rear leg. And then I come out. I take again a breather, maybe a second or 5, and then I do it again. And what this facilitates is that I am working at my maximum capacity, so trying to stimulate that growth immediately through every part of this entire pattern for as long as I can. So I recruit muscle fibers all the way from type 2C and down, or I recruit all of them all at once. And because I'm working at this max over time, I decrease, or I tend to decrease the amount of load that I can carry. So I will involve more of my hands, support a bit more on my legs, or eventually take maybe one backpack I release of myself, but I still keep going. And this means that I work each leg for around 5 to 7 repetitions per session per week. So it's one set, 5 to 7 repetitions per leg around. Sometimes with the legs I can often do a little bit more, but that covers for around 3 to 5 minutes a week. So this is one pattern that you can do as well. You can set up it like this. I work with an elevated element because I really love the fact that you can manipulate your center of mass a bit more proficient in this way. You have a lot of weight on top of you. You have a door frame or 2 pillars, and then you're just going to push up. You can watch this or re-watch this a couple of times so that you know exactly how to stimulate it according to your needs. But basically, load yourself as much as you can. If you can't do it with weights yet, start out without, and that's how you're gonna gradually work this pattern upwards. Then I want you to see more of this end range strength. So the 2 patterns that you can incorporate here are, first is standing pancake. So a standing pancake also works hip flexion, or at least we're moving into hip flexion. But what we tend to do, or we try to do here, is we try to elongate the posterior chain, so the muscles on the backside of the body, into their maxed stretched position. And that stretching element is a sensing element. So we're basically letting the body or the brain and the nervous system know that we're going into an end range position of certain joints where the tissues are stretched. Then once they are stretched, that is often when you feel these tingling sensations. And that is basically the moment where the brain and the nervous system is sending signals of, hey, we're potentially going into ranges that we cannot control yet. Then the opportunity for us is to sent to the brain and the nervous system. No, we can control here, which is a double effect of building in this protective layer, decreasing potential the need for the brain and the nervous system to send powerful nociceptors to these areas that you're in pain, or you might feel in pain. Plus, over time, the brain and the nervous system could give you a little bit more range that you can then again build strength into. So we use the stretch to get into the position, to use it as this sensing mechanism that it is, and then we provide very strong, powerful contractions in order to send the brain and the nervous system we're safe. So what you do here is you get into a stance of around 5 to 7, in between 5, 6, 7 steps in terms of its width. The wider you go, the more you're involving the adductors as well. So you want to be a little bit in the middle here. And what you then do is you lower yourself until you hit your max range of motion. And then after the test, what you're then going to do, so you know your position, you go back down, you grab yourself behind the legs. And then what you want to do is you want to drive the belly towards the ground, but you're trying to also get upright. But your arms are preventing this because they have you locked in that position. So what you're basically doing is you're trying to maximally contract by moving your torso back up, but you prevent this by having your arms locked behind the legs. And therefore you can send these very powerful and potent signals across the posterior side that is being stretched. And every time what I like to do is the moment you have contracted maximally, you then see if you can go a little bit lower in terms of bringing the belly more towards the ground. Now, the goal objective for this position is that you want to bring the head between the legs as much as you can. So eventually the end position is that your head is in between the legs, so that you have maximally control in almost a very deep hip flexed position, and therefore control of the posterior chain in this position as well. So as you can see, I'm trying to contract the posterior chain as hard as I can, and every time after 1 to 3 contractions, I lower a little bit more and lower a little bit more until over time, after sessions arise on a week-to-week basis, I can cover more range in a safe regard and have the brain and nervous system also feel safe in this deeper position. So this is another exercise that you can do, apart from the one leg squat, that is more orientated towards building that end range capacity, in which we're using the movement direction of flexion at the level of the hip, but we're strengthening the posterior chain at this end position. Then finally, we've got the hip airplane, a very special exercise in my opinion. Now with the hip airplane, the reason why I think it's so potent, I also have another video on the YouTube channel if you want to go have more of a deep dive. But the reason why I love it so much is that because it has multiple components, but it specifically works your glute in its maximal expression that it can. So for a lot of people that I've seen is, because of a low stimuli over time, the glutes have not been expressed in its fashion as is. So the glute has a very cool shape, where it has more of a forward-backward shape, but also more of an adducting or abducting shape. So it's not just forwards of backwards striated position or a side to side. It's more of a blend. And with the hip airplane, what you tend to do, you should try to utilize that in its maxed position, and you do that by being or having your position at the level of the hip in a little bit of a hinge. So we're flexing the hip a little bit as well, but we're trying to differentiate between the hip towards the hip and femur area between two sides. So we work one side in which we can very easily see the differences between left and right, and also try to mitigate them. So what you do with the hip airplane, or at least in this variant that I like to work with, is that we keep the feet on the ground so that we have a bit of support. But what we want to do is you want to have that one side in a flex position, and you want to have weight on the arm that is free on the side that is not working. Also have your hand against the support. And then what you're doing is you're trying to bring your hand towards the ground in which you're going into a little bit of an adducted position. So the working leg is going more, or is working more into adduction, but because you are also rotating the pelvis in relation to the femur, there's also a bit of rotation involved. And those two movement elements, what they do is that they ensure that the glute that is surrounding the pelvic area and attaches towards the femur, it truly, you're creating sort of this very sharp angle at the level of the ball and socket joint, and that creates a lot of stretch in which you can then accumulate strength in on the glute. Very potent exercise. And then as you go up, you tend to rotate out, in which you're moving more of into an external direction of the front leg, so that that glute is coming from a stretch position towards this, from a stretch position towards a contracted position, and you work more of an external orientation, but still in this hip position. So this is again a very potent tool in which you want to go as low as you can, get that maximal stretch on the glute, and then come back out upwards. So very potent, 3 exercises that you can do. This exercise, the hip airplane, also has a video on the YouTube channel if you want to check it out in more detail. Same goes for the standing pancake. But these 3 elements, or these 3 movements, are very vital to building those anti-fragile and athletic hips, because they restore a lot of range of motion and near end range, build a lot of full range strength, and also have you improve your glute expression, or how much the glute can express force production and strength. While working these 3 patterns among 3 others as well, Keith, who is a 76 powerlifter, who came to me with after having a hip replacement and severely decreased his output with deadlifting, also had more issues around his hips and also felt more unstable on his hip. After just a couple weeks in the protocol, having worked in the full range of motion, the most restricted areas of his hips, is now deadlifting 20% more without doing a lot of warm-ups, etc., and also feeling much less restrictions around the hips. Or Matt, who came to me with a hip impingement, wanted to move more functionally after a lot of traditional lifting. So what we did after very precise signaling and some assessments, after a couple of weeks his hip impingement was gone, where we try to work some rotational elements, but also a sissy squat, which has you moving your hip in a little bit more extension under load. And then after a couple of weeks, he was able to go much deeper, no pinch anymore, and even doing weighted versions. Or Jill, very beautiful case, a woman who came to me a couple of years ago with lower back issues, irritations around her hips and knees that felt aggravated. After 3 months of working together, she was able to do her to execute on her passion, which was to garden pain-free. No more lower back issues. She also unlocked a deep squat in that time period. So very proud of what she did back then. Or Charlie, who came to me after years of really heavy lifting. He could lift, he could squat, I think, 180 kg without a warm-up, but he had severe lower back issues. So what we did is we assessed his hips, predominantly also a little bit of the T-spine and shoulders, but especially his hips showed a lot of restrictions, focused in on those areas, and after 4 weeks already, his lower back issues were almost completely gone. Or Gio, who had a severe ankle injury at the level at the age of 15, which inhibited him of performing a deep squat. Then after 3 months into the protocol, by specifically working his hips, he was able to deep squat again in a pain-free fashion. So these are all results of people that have had issues across the chain and also at the region of the hips, and working specifically with a couple of patterns for very precise signaling per week. And 3 of these are already mentioned, but I'm running a current protocol. It's on a time limit, which expands on it with 3 more movement patterns in which you can do for 25 minutes a week. You can check the link below. And if you want to dive in and have more of a personalized approach, where we really go and check your current status, assess what is going wrong, assess the hips and other regions as well, and give you a full program according to your needs, there's also another link in there. So if not, you can check out the free videos on the channel, especially the hip airplane is something I would recommend checking out. And if not, see you in the next one.